We're going to be looking at why it's vital to have a digital strategy and how your organisation can start taking the key steps to form one. And we all know that a digital strategy is now essential to maximise the potential for growth and impact that digital brings. And in this session, we've got Charity Digital CEO Jonathan. Jonathan will be leading, and joined by Giles Woodhouse, Chief Strategy Officer at Wessex Archaeology. Both will be sharing useful tips and resources that will help elevate or develop your organisation's digital strategy. Before I pass over to Jonathan and Giles, just to remind you all that we will be having a 10-minute question and answer time at the end. If you want to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar. Let's keep the discussions going. We've had lots of chats so far in the morning, and we really want to know your ideas and what your thoughts are. So let's get this going, and I will hand over to Jonathan and Giles. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Liz. We've got a lot of content to cover here because digital strategy is a really huge subject overall. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We've actually written a guide that backs this session up as well. So we will share after the session details of how to access that. So in terms of digital strategy, this is an area that I'm really, really passionate about. You know, I've worked in my whole career, I've worked in the digital area, and for a lot of that time, really very focused on the whole area of strategy as well. And I think it's just such an important subject area. But let's start off by talking about why do you actually need a digital strategy? And I guess in one sense, you don't need a digital strategy. What you really need is a strategy that has digital running through it and is properly linked to it. But I think that's often hard to develop in kind of in isolation, and therefore kind of having this temporary focus on digital strategy, drilling down into it in more detail is a great way to actually get to that end point of having digital running through your strategy. And I guess much in the same way that you might have a marketing strategy to your organization that kind of sits at the level of detail down from the overall organization strategy. What are other reasons? Well, very much for this sector, like some other sectors as well, we've seen a lot of income challenges. Obviously, you know, in lockdown, visitors weren't able to visit many sites. Even now, we're talking obviously about, you know, reduced footfall. And even if you're not a visitor attraction, you know, there'll be a lot of other restrictions that are maybe restricting you. If you're relying on public fundraising, you might be finding that much harder as well. So income challenges are a real issue. And then, of course, staying relevant and connected to audiences, particularly if you've got less footfall. How do you actually stay relevant and connected to those audiences? It's a real challenge. We've seen digital communication provide lots of opportunities to communicate more directly with audiences, which is brilliant. But also those spaces, those digital spaces are getting really crowded now. So how do you actually make your voice stand out? So lots and lots of challenging reasons why you might want to focus on having a digital strategy or making your strategy more digital. But of course, as you start to work through the possibilities of what digital might do for your organization, what you start to see is lots of competing needs and actually too many different things that you might be able to undertake for the time and resources that you have. So the digital strategy process is designed to actually help you think through, you know, what are those different options? How should they be prioritized? And how do those align with the resources that you've got in your organization? So let's start by talking about what do I actually mean by digital strategy? I'm going to do that by decomposing it. I'm just going to break it down into the two words. What is strategy? What is digital? So strategy, I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with this. I like this definition. So it's a general plan to achieve one or more long-term or overall goals under conditions of uncertainty. It's about then setting goals and priorities, determining the actions to achieve those goals. And I think really, really importantly, actually mobilizing the resources that are able to execute those actions. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about strategy. But what do I mean by digital? And this is a bit more challenging because digital actually seems to mean so many different things to different people. So let's start with the Wikipedia definition of digital. So they talk about digital technologies being electronic tools, systems, devices, and resources. So well-known examples: social media, online games, multimedia, and mobile phones. So quite a techie definition there, actually. The co-op definition, which you see here as well, applying the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. So this really brings some very different aspects into view, which go far beyond the technologies and the tools. At Charity Digital, our view is that digital strategy actually needs to incorporate all of these things. So yes, it needs to include technology. It also needs to include those areas that may be more familiar from a marketing perspective. So, you know, digital communications as well. And it's also vital that we think about the culture that we're bringing into our organization, and that we think about things like fundraising, service delivery as well. So we take a really very broad, very holistic definition of what we mean by digital. And so when we say digital strategy, we're talking about, you know, the plans, the actions, the resources that are put in place to actually deliver on that broad view of digital. So I'm going to hand this one to Giles to talk a little bit about what makes producing digital strategy hard, because I think it is an inherently hard thing to do, produce a digital strategy.
Jonathan, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Giles, and as you'll see from my backdrop, Heritage Alliance have been busily using me this week, so apologies for the backdrop from Monday's event. I suspect there's some nodding heads in the audience that I can't see, that probably even thinks that strategy is quite challenging. But what is it specifically about digital strategy? Well, one may actually relate to the former, and that an organisation may not have a well-defined strategy, and research would seem to suggest that a number of charities don't actually have that strategy well defined in the first place. Why is that a problem? That makes it really difficult then to anchor the digital strategy to what the organisation's purpose and aims and objectives are. Digital strategy certainly isn't an end in itself, but even if you don't have a well-defined organisational strategy, it is worth having digital strategy. You're just going to have to do a lot more work up front with the leadership in trying to actually clarify what it is that they want digital to do for the organisation. So what's its purpose? What's it going to do for the aims of the organisation? Is it about work with your beneficiary group? Could it be around your fundraising strategy and plans? Or is it to actually improve the efficiency of your business? They're all different things, but they require that understanding for you to plan a digital strategy. And the next one there on the list, lack of knowledge of digital technology. This is just such a big issue. The technology space is huge, and it's growing and ever changing. It's really difficult for one person to know everything about the organisation's strategy, and then to add that to know everything about digital technology. So what do you do about that? Well, you've got to work collaboratively. You've got to find those that have got that expertise in digital and technology, and you've got to bring them together, those responsible for strategy. And that could be quite challenging. They may not be natural bedfellows, and they may also talk a different language, but that is where the collaboration needs to overcome that. One of the things within your digital strategy may also actually be specifically addressing areas of low knowledge or understanding, whether that's through toolbox talks or perhaps short videos by those with the knowledge. Management of stakeholders is another area that needs to be addressed. It doesn't matter what size of organisation you are. Even small charities will have trustees, and they need to be brought into that digital strategy. If you're in a larger organisation, well, then you're going to be more complex. You're going to have more functions that the digital strategy has to serve, and there'll be a greater diversity of stakeholders, and each with different and sometimes competing needs. Fear of change. Yeah, well, people don't like being taken out of their comfort zone. People's reactions to actually doing all their business online has certainly probably hit the anxiety levels in a lot of people. And for us, you know, bringing the likes of the eponymous Phil Harding from Time Team fame onto an online environment has been quite something particularly scary for him. We are talking here particular concerns for those with limited digital or technology skills. However, there is a bit of hope within this. I think everyone will agree that the external impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have actually created a bit of a change momentum, change culture because of this adoption of digital means in order for us to do business. So if there's anything here in terms of overcoming fear of change, is you demonstrate what you have already done, and therefore actually this change and this situation has a bit of a silver lining for overcoming it. Culture, wow, for me possibly the one thing that any strategy often fails to prioritise. It's from your culture whether you'll get acceptance or resistance to change. Your organisation may not be correctly orientated to make most of digital. For culture change to happen, you've got to have change in mindset and behaviour. And this is harder to achieve. It takes longer because it needs embedding. And you may actually be able to implement new processes and technologies faster than you get those behavioural changes to make it stick. Other things around digital strategy and being more digital, you inevitably become less hierarchical, more data-driven. You need to become more responsive, and your approach around iteration and learning as you go may be different from the very deliberate planned ways in which you've brought about change in the past. I will return to some of these themes of change in people later on in the webinar, but for the last point, I'm going to return this back to Jonathan. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this last point has really become more heightened as we've moved into the digital era, what people call the digital era, because there's been a lot of encouragement to kind of iterate and learn. And there's actually a bit of a trap here, I think, because it's quite easy then to say, well, we'll just kind of work it out as we go along. And there's a real danger here because you can end up flip-flopping between one priority and another. And you might have a situation where you maybe launch a new service and it doesn't get much take up, so you'll assume it's wrong and scrap it. That's if you're just kind of taking an iterative view. But if it's based on a really well thought through strategy, then I think in that type of scenario, you're actually going to take a bit of time. You're going to say, well, why is it not getting taken up? You know, we've done our work, so it should be. We need to dig deeper into it. Have we got a marketing problem here? Is the service design wrong? Or are there other barriers to the take up? So I think there's a real balance. Yes, we want to iterate and learn as we go along, but we must set that in the context of a longer term strategy as well if we're going to be successful. But of course, that just makes it much harder, I think. So it's worth recognizing that and calling it out. But let's move on. So we've developed this model for digital strategy development, and we're going to talk about this today. Calls on quite a number of other sources. It is very much our model. It's not the only approach to doing this. I'm not even going to claim it's the best approach, but it is a holistic model. And for me, that's really important. So I've seen other people approach the kind of digital strategy planning process as maybe a very IT-centric process. Now, this has a stream of IT running through it because that's really important. But it's equally as important that we consider areas like people and change, that we're thinking about the communication aspects as well. So the more kind of what are traditionally viewed as marketing and comms aspects of our digital strategy. So we've designed this model with that in mind. The model looks like it's a linear process, so it looks like it goes from left to right, and that's a little bit misleading. Yes, I'd say at the left-hand side is really important. You do need to start with a strong link to your organization, vision, and strategy. And obviously, at the end of the process, you need to deliver some kind of plan. But you can jump around in this as well. So you might actually spend some time baselining to understand where you are before you spend lots of time then trying to develop the link to the strategy, the organization strategy. So it's fine to jump around, it's fine to iterate, doesn't have to be treated as strictly linear. I'll expand on more of these areas as I go along as well on the future slides as well. So let's jump into the detail a little bit more. So let's start off actually looking a little bit more at this subject that Giles has already touched on. So the importance of the link to the organization strategy as a whole. And I guess here what we're saying is, let's understand what the vision of the organization is, and let's understand what its key strategies are. And then let's try and drop out of that what the role for digital might be. So here I've got an example. It's kind of a semi-fictitious example, but it's something which you might recognize. So this kind of concept of a vision where we're going to try and establish the museum as a valuable resource for all sectors of society. And of course, that all sectors of society's got a real challenge in it, because that's really about being more inclusive, maybe opening up to audiences who aren't engaging at the moment. So maybe more ethnic minorities, more younger people, and the disabled. So that becomes a key element of the strategy here. But in terms of enabling that strategy, you want to retain your existing audience. Maybe there's a strategy to actually increase access to the archive as well. And for many organizations, sustainability is a real challenge. So there's actually a strategy that says actually we're going to need to save some money, both to make ourselves sustainable and actually to create the funds to invest in some of the new things we need to do in our other elements of the strategy which are above. So this is a fictitious example. And if you start to think a little bit digitally, so acquiring a new audience in under-engaged segments. So there's a real role for digital there, communicating to those segments, understanding how they're responding, and then refining that approach. In terms of increasing the access to the archive, well, there could be a digital role there. We can digitize the archive and provide remote access to that, as well as people just having to visit a facility. And in terms of improving efficiencies, well, there's a real opportunity here with things like some of the back office systems that you can implement, which can actually make your processes work more efficiently and enable you to actually save some time, which can be invested in other areas. So really what I'm talking about here is it's just trying to dig into the strategy and try to tease out the links to digital. Sometimes it'll be quite straightforward and obvious. Sometimes it might not leap out. So I'd say don't beat yourself up if it doesn't leap out immediately, because the other steps of the process that we're going to talk through start to dig into ways in which you might tease out more the role of digital in enabling this strategy. So you can go off, do the other steps, and then jump back to this stage of considering the link to the org strategy. Now, Giles, have you got anything to add to this, particularly from your years of heritage experience?
Jonathan, I thought I might just talk about Wessex Archaeology's strategy and vision and how digital's linking into that, if that's okay. So we've got a vision around promoting an appreciation of cultural heritage to all. Within that, we've got a strategic structure that has 3 pillars: one around our people, one around public benefit, and one around sustainable business. And our digital strategy is linking in to each of those 3 pillars in different ways. So if I take the people, we are dispersed over 5 locations. Our staff work out in the field on many, many sites. So connecting them together to promote and enhance our culture and sense of cohesiveness. We've invested in a social enterprise network. I won't mention which one, and we're about to adopt a different one. But that is a digital tool to help connect people and build that culture that supports the key people in our organisation. On the public benefit side, I know my studio manager's in the audience, but she's been incredibly busy during lockdown. We've not been able to engage our public face-to-face. So we've taken to all sorts of different online digital engagement strategies. Some funded, some off our own, using social media, webinar platforms, public talks, health and wellbeing events that are engaging participant groups to reach those new audiences you actually talk about in your slide. And then in terms of sustainable business, where we've worked there is adoption of collaborative working via one of the packages that's available to help promote the way in which we can be an efficient and effective collaborative business. So in each case, we've looked to our overarching strategy and how can digital enhance, promote or sustain each of those three aspects of the overall strategy.
Thanks, Giles. That's great to have you bring that to life a little bit more for your own charity, for your own organisation as well. Let's move along now to the next slide. So we've talked a lot about the link to organisation strategy. What I want to do now is talk about this concept of establishing your digital baseline. And we're going to do that by looking at these different aspects. So we're going to follow a flow through business process, applications and infrastructure, and also look at the area of digital maturity assessment, which I think could be really useful and helpful. So let's jump straight into the first of those, baselining your business processes. So business processes at a level of detail can be really complex, and I've actually got a much more complex version of this picture, which sits in our supporting digital guide. But very simply, at a high level, there are three types of processes really. There are what I call management and governance processes. So these are things like the risk management process for this organization, it's legal and it's planning. There's the operational processes, which think very much about the whole service delivery. So how does your organization deliver on a day-to-day basis? So that might be things like visitor services, conservation processes, education processes that you have. And then the commercial processes, so how are you marketing yourselves, getting support or engagement, fundraising, and other commercial processes which provide the finances to actually sustain your activities overall. And then at the bottom, we've got the support and enabling processes. So this will be things like the finance, the human resources, property management is going to be quite a big area, actually, obviously for quite a number of heritage organisations as well, and assets within that as well. And what we want to do really in this step is just think about those business processes and understand how well they're operating, and start to think about what the opportunity might be to improve those. You might have actually already done some of this in your organisation strategy thinking as well, if you've done that in great detail, in which case that'll kind of just accelerate this step. Because the reason we do this is when we go to the next step, thinking about applications, we can think about the applications that support each of those business processes, and we can start to identify them. So certainly if we think about the supporting processes, we'll have business applications like maybe finance, human resources, what's supporting the marketing and communications, customer relationship management. You might have a system to an application to support that. And the purpose of doing this is you can look at what applications, what technology is actually supporting each of those processes. Where there is an application in place, you can ask questions about, how old is it? Is it meeting the organization's need? Is it supported? Because obviously old applications go off support over time. What's its future roadmap? How does it support the strategy overall? And then you can start to identify recommendations for the future. So there might be gaps where there are no applications and you think it'd be good to have them. There might be some solutions which actually need to be retired now because they're kind of getting a bit old, they're insecure, they're not supported anymore. And there might be things you would just want to replace or just upgrade as well. So just thinking that through can start to identify areas where you want to make changes. The next step is to then actually drill down to the next level below that, which is the infrastructure. And when infrastructure works well, I think we often don't think about it. It's just kind of there in the background and doing its job. But when it doesn't work well, it's a real pain, and I think we've all probably experienced that in the lockdown. You know, there might be I had a period when my network literally fell apart at home, and my broadband was giving me an awful signal, and it was a real pain, and I just had to buy a new router at the end of the day. But I wasted a lot of time before I got to that point. So bad infrastructure costs a lot of money, and the purpose of this slide is really say, you know, just think about the infrastructure of your organization. Think about the applications you've got and what infrastructure it's running on. Think about things like the devices that people use, where's data being stored. Also think about telephones and security. And again, we're saying ask the same types of questions. So look at the age, the support, the roadmap, and the impact of this area of infrastructure, and then develop recommendations from that. As part of this, also think about the whole governance and support. So both how people are being supported on a day-to-day basis, and particularly if you've got people working at home. Actually, this can be a real issue. You know, how are you actually supporting those people at home if they've got problems? So the whole aim of this, at the end of this process, is you'll come up with recommendations of things to change, retire, upgrade, etc. So that's one aspect of baselining, which I think is super useful to do. Digital maturity actually comes at it from a different perspective. There's a couple of digital maturity tools that I really like. I like the one that the NCVO have produced, and I really like the work that's been done on the digital compass as well. And obviously the digital compass is very much focused on heritage, arts and culture organisations, so it's really pertinent to those of you who are joining us here today. This is a slide. I'm sorry, it's a bit small. It was a bit of a challenge to get it all onto one page. Slides are being circulated afterwards, will be accessible, so you can look at this in a bit more detail. But the digital compass has 12 different dimensions that it identifies. 8 of them are business areas. So there's some overlap here with actually what I was talking about before. So things like some of the processes, marketing, communications, fundraising and development. And 4 of them are capability focused. So they look at areas like accessibility, skills, data and inclusion. And they work through more of a self-assessment question basis. So you can actually get insights pretty quickly by going through the online process of answering those questions for the digital compass. It enables you to both set out a desired position which you want to be in. That's the bit that's shown in green on this chart. The compass gives you both the visual representation as a chart, which is on the left here, and a percentage representation on the right. And then you can assess yourself against those targets. And that might help you to identify where the biggest gaps are. You know, so on this example here, we've got target for inclusion's 100%, we're at 50%. You know, that kind of suggests that maybe inclusion should be a priority for the organization. So it's really useful to go through the baseline digital maturity process to kind of think of other aspects of what you might want to change and improve through your digital strategy. The next area to think about is trends and opportunities. So the preceding slides have been very much focused on kind of looking internally at how the organization's doing. Trends and opportunities is really looking outside the organization and seeing what's happening in the wider world. And I like to look at it from these 2 perspectives. So let's look at the technology trends and let's look at the demographic trends. So technology trends, there are lots of those. I've picked out a few on the slide here on the left. So things that are quite interesting, particularly to the heritage sector, might be the decreasing cost of virtual reality. So, you know, what does this mean as an opportunity for heritage organisation? On the threat side, we're seeing increasing cyber attacks. So what's the implication of that? How can we use speech recognition to increase accessibility? So the whole purpose here is to just think about the trends and think about the opportunities that those present to execute better on your organization strategy. And when we look at the demographics, I think there's two aspects to consider here. You know, what's happening from a segmental viewpoint. So, you know, one of the big trends we're seeing in our society is the rapidly increasing number of people over the age of 65. So as a heritage organization in the short term, you might say that's really great because we've got an increasing audience of people who are going to be retired and able to spend time engaging with us. But obviously as those people maybe get over 75 or 80, whatever the age is, at some point they're going to become a bit less mobile and less engaged, and eventually actually die off. So, you know, how are you refreshing that audience? So actually thinking about, you know, what's happening to the segments who are engaging with you. So you might identify on age, birth rate, education. So how are you engaging with people with different educational backgrounds? It's a whole range of different things you can look at in terms of segment changes. And then what are the segment preferences as well? So one of the things that's very clear to me with children, kind of teenage, early 20s as well, is just how this segment hates using the telephone. So if you're kind of basing any type of service or access on a telephone, they're not interested. They just want to do text and messaging. You know, so that's a very clear segmental preference, which if you want to engage with this audience, you might want to build into your strategy. I want to ask Giles here to come in again and say, you know, have you got anything specific you'd add from your experience here?
Yeah, Jonathan, one in a work-related way and one from just being a parent of young adult children. The first one are really about segment preferences and consumption. We've just recently discovered that on our YouTube channel, as we're doing sort of the analytics of what actually works and holds attention, we're finding that actually attention spans are quite limited, even with rich digital content, and 2 to 3 minutes engagement time is where we get our best hits. So it's little nuggets like that you need to look for. You know, when I was growing up, if I wanted to socialise, I either queued to use a public telephone box or very anxiously used the phone with my parents listening. So I went and met my friends in a pub to socialise. I find my two boys through gaming, and I notice you've got that up on technology trends, but that is a communications tool. So, you know, how do organisations like us sort of access that audience when their primary means is through a gaming device? So where I'm really going with this, I think, is you've got to test your assumptions that you might make around your segments. For those of you that are used to marketing exercises, I would commend that audience segmentation work that actually helps you understand that audience and how you need to then address those communications access issues.
Brilliant. Thank you, Giles. Right, let's keep moving along. I'm conscious that time is moving fast. So we're going to build out some more elements of the model now. So we've done the 4 boxes on the left. We're going to focus a little bit more on the middle 3 blocks now. So planning activities, people and change, technology, data and risk. Going to run through some of these fairly quickly, particularly planning activities. So planning activities it's really a bit of a placeholder for quite a number of different tools, techniques and ways of thinking about digital that don't naturally fit into other parts of the model. You know, they're typically less IT focused here and more kind of marketing, audience engagement focused. I'm not going to talk about these in great detail because of time, but very quickly. So reporting. So thinking through your digital strategy, what are the key KPIs that maybe you're going to be reporting on a regular basis that enable you to know how you're doing on your digital strategy? How are you accessing those and how are you able to report on them? Worth thinking about that. Under innovation, we've got in the accompanying guide, we've got 4 models of innovation. So we talk about things like radical innovation, disruptive innovation, routine innovation, and also architectural innovation. Haven't got time to talk about those in any detail, but it's useful stimulus material to think about different forms of innovation. Project and product management. So certainly if you're running a number of different projects in your organization, is it worth thinking about how you standardize that from a digital perspective so that they run in a consistent way, so that people can jump between projects and understand where they are and contribute? And certainly some organizations who are being very digital in their service delivery like to think about their digital offering to their end users as a product in its own right. So they start to think about, okay, this digital product we've got, what do our consumers want from it? How are we going to evolve this as a product? What are the new features that we're going to bring out, and when are we going to bring out? So that can be a really useful way of thinking about your whole your products overall. That overlaps a bit with service delivery, and I think the point about the service delivery that is so important is making sure we're putting the user at the center of what we're doing and being user-led in terms of what we're providing. Communications planning. I think the big thing on communications planning, and this is particularly if you maybe have a number of different external communication streams going, is just thinking about how you synchronize the plans of those different communications to increase impact. So I know there was one organization that was running a Christmas fundraising campaign, and by synchronizing what they were doing, some of their other communication streams, they were actually able to double the income they raised through that. So it can be really significant what's achieved through that. Audience insight. So how are we getting that audience insight? How are we getting the data to understand about their engagement? So it can be through Google Analytics. We can look at Facebook audience profiles. If we've got a CRM system, we can take data off that. We can look at email marketing stats, fundraising database analysis, surveys, lots and lots of tools we can use here to get more audience insight. And then finally flowing through into a way of actually planning our content as well, so that we're actually planning the content. And this is obviously kind of the parallel session to the one that we're doing here, which is talking about this in more detail. So the content that's actually going to motivate the actions that we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. Owing to time, not going to spend any more time on this because I'm really keen to move on to the next slide, which I think is super important, people and change. And Giles is going to talk about this in more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's been my experience that people are often overlooked in digital strategy because it's seen as a technical activity and perceived to be perhaps the domain of the IT department. And if I was to say one thing, I'd say that's a recipe for disaster. You've got to put the user experience at the forefront of considerations of digital strategy in order to get success. So that leaves me engage with the staff being the first point. Ask them, how are they experiencing digital today in your organisation? Take their input and consider their feelings, thoughts and opinions. And I do stress feelings because that will determine the change journey and whether or not it'll be successful. Consult and engage at regular intervals and seek feedback, because this is one of the mechanisms for getting staff involved. Digital leadership being the next point. You do need to understand the difference between the expert digital leadership and those then in leadership that are about empowering and enabling the organisation to adopt digital strategy. So my organisation, the former would be the Chief Technology Officer and the remainder would be the rest of the C-suite and the senior management team. And they all need to align and be champions for the digital strategy. The next one around culture, we touched on this earlier, but there is much to consider. In terms of driving motivation to embrace digital, you need to tell your audience what's the benefit for them. What's that better end state going to be? How is their job going to be made easier? Encouraging ownership as well. How do you involve the staff? Because if you do involve the staff, they then inevitably psychologically buy into the program and therefore they become invested in its success. And that, I talked on this earlier, promote collaboration. And I'm thinking here perhaps intergenerational collaboration, getting your junior staff, who we assume to be the really tech savvy people, to mentor perhaps the senior staff that have got the responsibilities and the managerial requirements to make this digital strategy work. Set out a compelling organisational imperative for everyone to get behind. It's quite easy when you have an external threat like COVID-19 pandemic. Sometimes it can be a bit more challenging when it's an internal driver for change. But you've got to focus that effort on behavioural change. It takes time, as I said before, and you've got to do more than just those initial briefs and training sessions in order to get that behaviour embedded. It requires repetition. Do things like recognition, celebrate the successes on the way, celebrate those champions that do go the extra distance, and create that environment of rapid iteration and learning. You're experimenting here, and you need to share those insights quickly for that adoption process. Turning to digital capacity then, have you got the capabilities in the organisation to do this, and have you got enough of it? If you have too few individuals that have got this capability, you will lose momentum and that ability to embed the changes that you desire from your strategy. Find your potential champions, those pioneers and early adopters, train them up, bring them on board. If you don't have the resource to do that, or you need to bring in external expertise, then consider getting an external agency. But do make sure they are the right fit for your organisation and ensure that they tailor their approach and materials accordingly. That'll give you a bit more breathing space to build up your internal capacity and then move on to do it internally. Another point is you need to think about the right model here. Is this a central team approach? Is this a hub and spoke? Or is it a more decentralised approach? And that will relate to how your organisation is structured and operates. Learning and development, really this is about investing in the skills that the organisation needs to deliver and operate the digital strategy. And you must remember also the digital leaders within that, because technology is developing so quickly. Notes that the technology itself won't do this for you. That learning experience tends to be better if it's experiential and hands-on. Recruitment, point on that, you may need to bring in additional capability to deliver your digital strategy. I would turn to your expert digital leader to clarify what is required and for how long. And you also need to be really realistic, particularly those that are charities on a budget, of what you actually have to pay, because your charitable pay scales may not actually be enough to meet the skill levels you require from the marketplace of a very high demand skill set. That is a real skip over. This is quite a deep topic, and I'm very sorry that we can only gloss over some of those aspects, but I hope that's useful. Jonathan, back to you.
Right, so moving along. So technology, risk and data. So we've already touched on infrastructure, so I'm not really going to say too much more about that. But I guess one of the key things to consider here is, if you're doing things like introducing more video services, then you need to make sure you're putting more bandwidth into your network so that people can access it. So very easy things that might be seen as kind of sexy technology, shiny technology, if you haven't thought about the infrastructure that supports them, can actually perform very badly. In terms of data, I think I've touched on its importance in understanding audience behavior, but how is that data actually collected and pooled? And one of the challenges we start to see very much is that as organizations start to become a little bit more digital, what they start to do is they start to use a number of different, often software as a service applications, which many of these are really very, very good. You can get them up and running really quickly, but they start to have little islands of data that exists within these solutions. And if you're trying to build a consolidated view of an audience and how they're behaving, it's really hard to do that. So people at certain time in their evolution often want to start actually investing in how they bring all of that data and manage it as a whole. Security, this subject that we've done many webinars on, it's really important. At a base level, It's really important to make sure you are retiring obsolete technology. You know, Windows 7 is not now supported, so it's getting no security patches. Office 10 is going off support soon as well. Those are very obvious examples, but there might be other solutions you're using that are unsupported. If you're using WordPress, there are many great, websites which are run using WordPress. They use a lot of plugins. Typically, those plugins all need to be kept up to date, replaced, etc. And when you're thinking about your security software, you want to think about endpoint, but you might also want to think a bit more broadly. So things like breach and threat scanning. And finally, ethics. Two aspects of this: algorithms. So the government have obviously illustrated with the whole exam fiasco the importance of actually making sure algorithms are well thought through and tested and are ethical in their application. So if you are thinking about using anything from an AI perspective and algorithms, it's really important to consider those. And I think digital exclusion is a real ethical point as well. So if we are excluding people from accessing what we do, that's not really ethical. So we need to think about how we digitally enable them to engage more with us as well. So that's a very quick skip over that. This is a really important slide to how we actually pull everything together. Because if you've been through the earlier stages, I've talked about what will have happened is you will have generated a lot of options, a lot of things you could do. And the challenge here is there's going to be too many. You won't be able to afford to do them all. You won't have the resource, you won't have the money. So at this stage of the process, we actually identify the priorities, so what we're going to focus on. And I find this type of grid, which looks at the one axis at the overall impact and on the other axis at cost and resource, really helpful. And what we want to do here is really try and pick out ideally those types of things which are very high impact. So maybe giving us better services, better outcomes. So, higher conservation levels, more education, preservation, etc. So those things which are high impact and ideally low cost. So those are the real kind of no-brainers for us to do. Often in life, though, the highest impact things tend to be more expensive as well. So they become strategic investments. It's fine to do those, but they need to be planned for because they need funding. They need investment to make them happen. So you can't do too many at once. Sometimes to get going, tactical deployments can be great because they're, middling impact, but actually maybe super low cost. So you can kind of get on and do those, demonstrate some benefit, and actually use that to build momentum into a digital strategy. And at the end of the day, the thing you want to avoid are the high cost, low impact type of initiatives. But if you just think this through against the options you've developed, it's a great way of helping you then shape your plan. And this is an example of what a plan might look like. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail. You can see the slide later. But I think the important points are here is I've actually followed the plan through the three streams that we talked about. So that avoids us just coming up with a pure techie plan. And also it goes out over 3 years. There always tends to be too much in year one. So part of the challenge is to rephase, to push things out into later years. It's all right to have less in the later years because new possibilities and options will evolve and be added into those years as you get nearer to them. And very quickly, final slide. So Giles touched on stakeholder management. Don't forget about it. Do it ideally all the way along the line from a very early stage. Refresh your strategy in the light of experience. Don't boil the ocean at the start. If you tried to do all of this framework from the start and you hadn't done any of it before, it would take you too long to get to a result, I think. So I would say, pick off some of the areas that are going to have the most impact to get some shape to your strategy. Put into the strategy the things you need to learn about and identify those as actions that you're going to do, and maybe some of them in year one, some in year two. And don't seek perfection. Good enough will do to get you going. And always, make sure the actions are supporting the strategic priorities. So that's all we're going to do on presenting. we're a little bit over time. We were a little bit late starting as well. So we're going to have time for 5 minutes of questions. There is also, I'm doing a round table later, so you can ask questions there as well. But Liz, you're going to take us through the questions now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hi, I'm just having issues starting my video. If you could just do that at the back end, that would be brilliant. Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Giles. That's given us some really good takeaways and food for thought. Brilliant. Thank you. We've got some good questions coming up. As Jonathan has already said, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we won't be able to answer them all. But we will take them offline, some of them offline, and you can also get in contact with Charity Digital, or you can contact Giles directly as well. So let's skip over to these questions. Delphine would like to know, would you recommend that heritage boards look to include trustees with digital specialism going forward to ensure digital strategy is done throughout the organisation?
Okay, I'll start on that then. It's absolutely essential, I'd say, that your board has some appreciation of digital on it. It doesn't have to just all sit in one person. I'd say they don't even need to be, quote, an IT specialist, but somebody who's kind of got a digital mindset, who's thinking about it, I think is absolutely vital. Just in the same way as I'd say, you know, you should have somebody on your board who has a strong finance background as your trustee. Digital is important. So you've got to have somebody who's thinking with that mindset sat around the table.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. We have a question here from Melanie. Do you include digital exclusion as part of the digital strategy?
I'll pick up a lead on that one, Liz. I think it's a really important point in the ethics that Jonathan highlighted earlier. As we increasingly go on to more online digital engagement, we've got to think about that end user, whether they've got a platform, whether they've got the environment in which they can access the platform, and we're thinking particularly at some of the more vulnerable groups, young people, perhaps not in ideal circumstances where they can engage in digital content from this sector. So there are absolutely a requirement for us to look specifically about, are we creating a worse situation than we're already trying to address?
Brilliant. Thank you, Giles. That's really good. Thank you. Louise is asking next, and she is saying, an internal culture change can be a bit of an issue with volunteer-led organisations. Have you got any tips to push against resistance to include more digital activities? Great question. Who would like to take this one up?
I'll let Giles lead, as he did the he did people and change in the presentation.
Yeah. That is such a good question. I'd say with no easy answer. I think this is down to the need to engage with your volunteers. Your volunteers have very specific things in mind when they join your organisation to do what they think is their part. And you have to tread very carefully on their philosophy, their beliefs and what they're doing. So if you're going to engage and get them to change and embrace digital, you've got to come at it from what their motivations are for being the volunteer in the first place. So again, it's back to that sell. What's the benefit for them, and how are you going to help them towards that adoption of that new digital approach, technique, or piece of technology? I think that is the only way, and you probably need the right interlocutor, the trusted agent that's perhaps looking after the volunteer network, or someone that you can access that can then speak on behalf of the volunteers. I think that would be my best approach in response to that.
Okay, thank you, Giles. I think we've got time for just one more, okay, very, very quickly. Liz is asking, are there any resources or information banks to help you scan and understand new technology trends and the needs of different segments and audiences?
Yes, there are, and I've got a really quick answer to this. Our digital guide actually lists out a whole load of these different resources. So what we'll do is after this event, we'll publish along with the slides the link to that digital guide, which you can then download, and you can then follow all of those links to those different resources.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up for today. As has been mentioned in the discussions, you will be able to view all of the slides and the resources afterwards. We'll let you know when those will be available. Just want to say a very big thank you to Jonathan and Giles again for joining us for this session, and enjoy the rest of your morning. Thank you.